I want to welcome everyone to this program to discuss the rise of modern conservatism, IU's role in the rise in modern conservatism, note the 50th anniversary of the Goldwater campaign. It's great to see this kind of a turnout. I was talking to the speakers that I'm sure when I was a freshman here, I would not have jumped on hearing about the William Jennings Bryan campaigns or the Charles Evan Hughes campaigns, although they would have been interesting, I know. I think what's different here is that the campaign in 1964, I think still has a lot of relevance to today, and a lot of connections can be made between what happened then and what these two individuals did then and afterwards, and what's going on in politics today. My name's Paul Helmke. I'm a professor of practice at SPEA, School of Public and Environmental Affairs. I've been at IU now for, I think this is my 4th semester. I teach urban policy, law and public policy classes at SPEA, and in addition, I direct something called the Civic Leaders Living Learning Center. Some of the students from the Civic Leaders Center are here today. These are primarily freshmen. This is our second group of freshmen that live together in one of the dorms. They take academic classes together, and we do programming for them, usually twice a week. So this is one of our weekly programs that we thought would be of interest to the broader university community and to some other friends. So thank you all for being here. I got interested in this topic. I'm a political junkie. And in 1964, I traveled to San Francisco, the Cow Palace, for the Republican National Convention. I had a Fort Wayne for Barry sign that they wouldn't let me take in, but I took it out there, at least held it up, and was a big Goldwater fan. I even found my Conscience of a Conservative edition from June, I think 1961, 12th edition, and still have that in paperback version. But the Goldwater campaign was a campaign. Everyone knows how it turns out. Goldwater got beat very badly. LBJ got the highest percent of popular vote still in history. All of the post-election pundits basically talked about the death of the Republican Party. But then 2 years later, when I was a college freshman here, all of a sudden you saw people winning, Republicans winning in places like California and Illinois and Massachusetts, and their faces getting on the magazines. And of course, the primary winner of that election was Ronald Reagan in California, who came to prominence 50 years ago Monday when he gave his time for choosing speech. So a lot of things from back then I think still connect today. The rise of Reagan, the change from the solid South being Democratic to Republican. Most of the Southern Democrats that we've read about in the news for years started out as, the Southern Republicans started out as Democrats. So you saw those changes in the party. You saw the rise of Newt Gingrich and now the Tea Party today. That's all I'm going to say. I'm going to wait for the experts to talk about what went on. I asked these two people because when I started at IU in 1966, these were two of the big names. Tom Charles Houston, I didn't know at the time, but he was a legend. Especially in the Phi Kappa Psi fraternity house. I was a Phi Kappa Psi, as were these two gentlemen, and everyone talked about Tom Houston, and a lot of people talked about Bob Tyrrell. And so I got to know Bob, and I knew of Tom, and so I'd heard about what they had done, I watched what they were doing, and I've followed their careers over the years, and it's been a fascinating one. So I'm looking forward to tonight's program. Let me thank some of the others that have helped sponsor this. Obviously, the folks at SPEA for helping to put this on, the College Young Republicans, and there's a new College Young Americans for Freedom chapter, I guess I represented here. The Phi Psi House, I know, sent some people. My Civic Leaders students, a lot of them are here, and just a lot of people in the community. I talked to friends, students I knew that were working on Ready for Hillary, and young Democrats as well. I think the lessons from today can be relevant to folks from all political and ideological stripes. So thank all those folks for being here. And our format, we'll have Tom Houston talk. He'll be introduced by one of my Civic Leader students. Then I'll have a Civic Leader student introduce our Emmett Terrell Jr. And then we'll go to questions from the audience. If you are shy and bashful, I've had a number of my students write out questions which were going to be actually good questions. So I might sneak a few of them in there while we get people lining up. we had originally talked about having a panel respond and question, and then we changed the format. The panelists are all here, and if they want to ask questions, they're happy. We're happy to take those too. But it should be an interesting evening. And to start out, we'll have Alexandra Smith from Granger, Indiana, a freshman who is the president of the Civic Leaders class, introduce our first speaker, Alexandra. Give her a round of applause. She's good. So.
Good evening. Tonight, there we go. Tonight, I'll be introducing Tom Charles Houston. Mr. Houston has been listed in Who's Who in America, the best lawyers in America, and Who's Who in Indianapolis commercial real estate. He was also the national chairman of Young Americans for Freedom in the early 1960s. He received his BA in 1963 and was awarded the Wells Senior Recognition Award. IU's top academic award for undergraduates based on excellence in academic achievement and contributions to the campus. After graduating with his JD from Indiana University in 1966, he served as an officer in the United States Army assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency and was associate counsel to the President of the United States from 1969 to 1971. He joined Barnes & Thornburg Law Firm, where he became a partner and was chairman of the firm's real estate department from 1976 to 1996. Mr. Houston now serves of counsel at Barnes & Thornburg, where he specializes in real estate finance, leveraging leases, and acquisition and deposition of real estate assets. He has been prominent in the historic preservation movement, serving as an officer and director of the Historic Landmarks Foundation of Indiana and Historic Indianapolis Incorporated, a director of Preservation Action, a member of the Board of Advisors of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and an avid collector of political buttons and campaign materials. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Tom Charles Houston.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be at IU, and lots of memories, lots of friends. So I appreciate this opportunity to talk a little bit about what it was like to be a young conservative on this campus 50 years ago. And I mean, one of the great Hoosier politicians was a fellow by the name of Jim Watson, who was a congressman from Rushville, later a member of the Senate, was majority leader during the Coolidge administration. A number of great stories about Watson. He went in to see President Coolidge one day, and it had been raining for 2 or 3 days. He went in, and Coolidge was working at his desk, didn't look up, and Senator Watson tried to figure out how to get the president's attention, and he said, well, Mr. President, I wonder if we'll ever quit raining. The president looked out behind him and said, well, it always has. And turned around and went back to work. When Watson first started, his first campaign was in 1896. When he traveled stump to stump, and the county chairman down there was taking him to his first speech during the campaign, and Watson gave a hell-bender speech. He had all the big issues, the tariff, free silver, everything he could think of. And on the way back into town, Watson wanted some reassurance, and he said to the party chairman, he said, well, how do you think I did? He said, well, Jim, I think you did real well. He said, well, you really think so? Yeah, Jim, you did just fine. He said, well, did I miss anything? He said, Jim, you did. You missed at least 2 good opportunities to sit down. So I don't want to miss those opportunities, and my wife will blow the whistle when the time comes. I'm going to leave to my brother Terrell the opportunity to introduce to you some intellectual insights of importance. My purpose here tonight is really pretty mundane. First, I want to tell you about the emergence of a consciously conservative student movement on this campus commencing in 1960. And then I want to try to tie that movement here locally into the bigger picture that really culminated in the nomination and the campaign of Senator Goldwater 4 years later. Now, when I came to Bloomington in the fall of 1959, there was one self-identified conservative on the faculty of the College of Arts and Sciences. And he also happened to be the only member of the faculty who had won a Pulitzer Prize. And that was R.C. Bewley, who was a professor of history. The closest thing to a conservative organization at that time was the Young Republicans, which, with all due respect to my friend Bill Jenner, was basically a captive of the Phi Delta Theta House that allowed their pledges to build up their credentials. In the Department of Government, where I was enrolled, and that's what it was then, before they became highfalutin and started thinking they were scientists. But in the Department of Government, we had a Republican who was the chairman of the Rockefeller campaign in Indiana. The faculty was what I call trilling liberals. Lionel Trilling wrote a book which was very popular at that time called The Liberal Imagination. And the basic thesis of that book was that the only and sole American tradition was liberalism. And that was self-evident to the faculty. They weren't malicious about it. They didn't think they were being unfair or unreasonable. That was simply the milieu, the intellectual milieu in which they all operated. So, when in 1960, when Senator Goldwater published a very small book called The Conscience of Conservative, and I heard about it, and so I went over here to the university bookstore, which is supposed to be the place where you find books of interest to students. I said, "Do you have this book?" Well, I never heard of the book. So I went down here to the bookstore on Kirkwood and said, "Have you got this book?" "Nope, never heard of that book." Well, I don't know if it's still there, but there was a Courage bookstore up on 3rd Street, just around Jordan. And I went up there and I said, "Do you have this book?" He said, "Yes, I read somewhere, I think it was the Chicago Tribune, that there was kind of a student cult developing around this book." And I said, "Well, I'm the cult, and I'm here to buy the book." So I bought the book, and that was in the spring. And that summer, home in Logansport, I took the time to read it. And it just clicked with me. What Senator Goldwater had to say, his ideas about the scope of government, the purpose of government, the methods by which we administer our government, struck a chord with me that had filled a vacuum. Up to that point, I had thought of myself as a Taft Republican. And for you young people, Senator Robert Taft of Ohio was the conservative leader of the Republican Party until he died in 1953, early in the Ike's administration when he was majority leader in the Senate. But there was a big vacuum from the death of Senator Taft until the emergence of Senator Goldwater in 1960 at the Republican National Convention in Chicago, where a bunch of young conservatives took it on, the young Republicans took it on themselves to promote Goldwater for the presidential nomination when everyone had come to town for the purpose of crowning Richard Nixon as the presidential nominee in 1960. But the Youth for Goldwater movement originated there in Chicago, and in a memorable event, you can see it on YouTube, Senator Goldwater addresses the convention, and he looks at the conservatives. He knows the conservatives, these young conservatives, feel like he's let them down by not being a candidate. And he says to the conservatives, grow up. If you want to nominate a conservative candidate for president, you got to go to work and you got to take control of this party. And so out of that convention, the remnants of the Goldwater for President Committee organized and met in Sharon, Connecticut that fall at the estate of William F. Buckley, Jr., who was the editor-in-chief of the National Review. And they organized the Young Americans for Freedom. This was in September of 1960.
When I came back during the summer after I read the Conscience of a Conservative, a fraternity brother, another phi-sci, my whole world revolves around phi-sci, and phi-sci at our Alpha chapter, DePaul, had told me about an appearance that a professor at the University of Chicago, George Stigler, who later won the Nobel Prize in economics, had given, and it had been sponsored by the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists, which is now the Institute for Advanced Studies, I think, Studies Institute. But, so they had an office in Indianapolis. I called the director, I went down, I met with him, and said, I'd like to form a group at IU, a conservative group, and you help? He said, yes, if you get the group together, I'll guarantee you some speakers. So I came to Bloomington in the fall of 1960, and in those days, back in the dark ages, when you enrolled for class, you went to the old field house, which was just across the street here, and they had, the departments had tables set up, and they had boxes with those old IBM index cards, and they had 30 of those cards, and if you got there early, and you wanted that class, and they hadn't given 30 of them away, and there's still one left, you got enrolled in their class. And student organizations would set up tables to try to recruit members. So I went over there, I set up a table, had a handwritten sign, said, IU Conservative Lake. And in the course of 2 days, I signed up about 15 or 20 folks who were interested. And so we convened and constituted ourselves the Indiana University Conservative Lake. And the first speaker we had that year, fall 1960, was Stan Evans, who then was the youngest editor of a major newspaper in the country, was editor of Indianapolis News. And he is the one who drafted the Statement of Principle for America's Freedom called the Sharon Statement. And we invited him to come down and speak, and we had a small group, and it was a good start. But we knew we had to step up the pace. Now, in those days, the most important issue for conservatives, young conservatives, any kind of conservative, was a fight against communism. We were in a real Cold War. There were real missiles. There were real threats. Those of us who were old enough remember vividly the days we did 48 years ago, the night President Kennedy gave his speech about the naval blockade in Cuba. And the prospect, I was an ROTC cadet, and a very real prospect that we were going to be shipping out in a major war. So when I talk about the importance of the communist issue, you have to try to relate to a world that most of you young people have never experienced. But for a young conservative, that was the #1 issue. And one of the big, as part of that broader issue of communism, was the question of internal security. And this was the McCarthy period, McCarthy era. Senator McCarthy had long just died in 1958. He was censured in 1954. But the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee was still in business. More importantly, the House Un-American Activities Committee was in business. And the HUAC, as we called it, was a major focus of opposition from young liberals and old liberals, or any kind of liberal. And at this time, there was an organized movement called Operation Abolition, which was driven largely by the Longshore Workmen's Union and other left-wing groups to attack the HUAC. And a film was made about this, and we invited a congressman by the name of Congressman Jackson, who took Dick Nixon's seat in Congress, and Nixon gave up when he was elected to the Senate. He was a member of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and so we invited him to campus. We were going to show the movie and have him speak. So we got the publicity out. Well, I'll tell you, you'd have thought the place blew up. I mean, all the great defenders of free speech in southern Indiana, the Indiana Civil Liberties Union, and the Unitarian Fellowship, and Lord knows who else, all raised holy hell. And it was an outrage that we were going to have this guy speak on this campus. And the Daily Student ran daily articles and features about this thing, and the Bloomington Herald Tribune for another one of our Phi-Psi brothers, Jim Polk, who later won a Pulitzer Prize, was working on the staff, wrote an article about, a front page article about this big controversy on campus. But the conservatives who come out of the woodwork are going to have this controversial speech. And so when we showed up, the crowd was huge. We couldn't fit them in the room. So we finally scrounged around. We found we had 290 some people for the meeting hall. It had 144 seats. But Congressman Jackson was one of these people, the only one who was able to make a controversial point of view across in such a calm, rational, and friendly sort of manner that he was well received, even though there were probably half or more of the audience was all upset about it. But it went very well. But the important thing for us was that it attracted the kind of attention that you otherwise could never have gotten, which in building the movement was absolutely critical. And so that was we regarded as a great success. And then the last meeting we had that semester was a seminar where we brought in a couple of professors from East Coast colleges to have a Saturday seminar on international communism and the Soviet Union. So that's basically how we got started and began to build a movement. And two of the things evolved out of that. One was that although I was not at the Sharon Conference where YAP was founded, in 1961 I was elected state president of the Young Americans for Freedom Meet Conference and all that we had at Wabash College. And from there, I later became Midwest chairman, and then I became national vice chairman. And in 1965, I became national chairman. And I was the first Protestant, I was the first Midwesterner, and I was the first full-time student to fill that position. And so the YAP movement, I guess, an organization, was a political action movement. The ISI, with whom the Conservative League was affiliated, was basically an educational group. It focused on education. The YAP was a political action group. And for a young YAPper in 1962, being a political action group meant you were an adjunct of the Goldwater movement. And in fact, we brought Senator Goldwater to IU in 1962, and he spoke here. We had a great crowd. I think Billy Susan Butcher tells me, I don't remember this, but he said we had like 2,000 plus students that showed up for that. And it was the Goldwater movement was the focus of our attention. In 1964, I was a full-time law student. I was one of these guys that was a scholarship student. I had to go to keep my grades up to stay in school. So, and I was a full-time student. Bill Jenner and I started at the law school in the summer of '64. But notwithstanding, I was a law student during the Goldwater campaign. My best estimate is I probably traveled something like 30,000 miles talking to student groups from Minneapolis to Birmingham, from New York and Boston to Denver. And in September we had a YAP National Convention in New York. It was just after Bill Buckley was the concluding speaker, and Bill broke the sad news to us that Senator Goldwater was going to get trashed. Now that didn't come as a big shock to anybody. But the interesting thing is, that was in September, but between then and the first week of November, which was the first presidential vote I ever cast, as I traveled all around the country, I never met one conservative who was discouraged. I never met one young conservative who thought the fight wasn't worth the fight, wasn't worth the effort. It didn't matter whether we won or lost, it was that we conducted this fight and that we organized a conscious conservative movement within the framework of the Republican Party. And that is basically what we did. Now, I want to briefly tell you that there's another aspect of the conservative movement on this campus which I think is important historically, and that is the way in which it changed the structure of student government as it existed in 1959. When I came here in 1959, there were two political parties, the Greeks and the independents. And your political allegiance was either if you were organized and during your sorority, you were in the Greek party, and if you lived in Residence Hall, you were in the Independence Party. And because of sheer numbers, the independents were successful in electing the freshman class president. And after 1959, they were largely successful in electing the student body president. But because the Greeks were much better organized, in fact, we had the option of if you didn't vote, you got fined. We controlled all the other junior and senior class officers. But what happened in that period, I was elected as student senate from a Greek district, the 505 buyout. My district was 3rd Street 2, and I had a great district. I had the campus, I had high fives, and I had somebody else, but I don't remember. Those were the only two that I ever went campaigning. But we soon developed that the issue that came up is in my early day in the Senate. And I served under the 5 different student body presidents. The first was Tom Atkins, who was the first black student body president at IU. He later was the executive director of the NAACP in Boston. And he was the best of the 5, in my judgment, even though we disagreed a lot. But at that time, the big issue was Castro in Cuba. And the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which was a commie front, was established here, and there was a big fight about whether you entitled to student recognition. In those days, the student senate had the authority to approve or disapprove recognition. There was a big fight about it. The Senate vote was closed. The recognition was approved. But again, as a consequence, what really happened was that there was a realignment in the Senate, so that the vote in the Senate was not Greek versus independent, it was conservative versus liberal. And as the issues began to evolve, after we lost that vote, a group of us organized a committee of 1 million opposed to the Castro Communist Revolution. And that was a classic Willie Lusenberg front group that we set up to mobilize student opinion, allow all of us as conservatives to communicate to a broader audience than otherwise we might be able to reach. But then later on, in student government, the realignment that effectively took place, and issues that were not just student issues became more important, and some of them were pretty dramatic. The fight over the National Student Association affiliation, the big one was the Young Socialist Alliance. The YSA was a big one for me because I gave a speech in Washington in which I accused President Starr and Dean Schaefer of giving the green light to the Reds. And it hit the headlines in Indianapolis Star, and when I got back to Bloomington, I had an invitation to see the president in his office. And I had to convince him, well, that wasn't quite what I said. So anyway, it was a good time, and each of these efforts moved towards increasing the conscious base of a conscious conservative movement. So what does it all come down to? What Goldwater matter to you now, or should matter to anybody now? And I think the answer to that is twofold. One was Senator Goldwater was the indispensable person around whom a viable political movement could be organized. There was no one else anywhere on the right. Of course, this was the time, of Kennedy. I mean, we were here during the Kennedy. One of the great war stories I can tell you is about the big rally that the Kennedy people had down the Courthouse Square that almost ended up in a riot, but during the '60 campaign. But Goldwater was the indispensable figure. There would have been no Ronald Reagan, no Reagan Revolution, if it hadn't been for Barry Goldwater. And the second thing is that without Barry Goldwater, it's unlikely that the conservatives would have ever succeeded in taking control of the Republican Party. From 1932, with the defeat of Herbert Hoover, until 1964, the Republican Party, National Republican Party, was essentially controlled by the Wall Street bankers. I sound like a commie, but essentially it's true. The Wall Street bankers and the financiers and the elites in Wall Street controlled the Republican Party through the Dewey Rockefeller establishment wing of the party. And in fact, there's no way you could get a conservative more wild up than to tell him here's an opportunity to go out and fight liberal Republicans. Much more enjoyable than ever fighting any Democrat. And so the real movement was to take control of the Republican Party away from the Eastern establishment, and Goldwater was a vehicle by which that happened. All across the country, the famous little women in tennis shoes, young people, housewives, out working and electing delegates, precinct committee people, and when 1964 convention came, the Republican Party was in the control of the conservatives and has been in the control of the conservatives for 50 years. Nobody runs on a national Republican ticket as anything today other than a conservative. Now, what kind of conservative they are and how credentialed they may be is one thing, but nobody's running as a Rockefeller Republican these days. And that's a big change.
Our next speaker will be introduced by another one of our civic leader students, E.J. Marin from Burbank, L.A., California. E.J.
Yeah, LA.
Okay, L.A., okay.
Hello?
Okay. Robert Emmett Terrell was born on December 14th in Chicago, Illinois, and graduated from Frenchwick High School in 1961, where he was on the swim team. He attended Indiana University to join the swimming team, where he worked alongside the famous coach Doc Councilman. While at Indiana University, he received his BA at IU in 1965 and received his master's in history in 1967. In 1967, Mr. Terrell founded The Alternative to act as a voice for other political ideas that he felt were not being represented on the IU campus. During The Alternative's early years, Mr. Terrell and his team would publish most of their stories from an old farmhouse in Ellettsville right outside Bloomington, Indiana. In 1977, Mr. Terrell changed the title of the paper, The Alternative, to its current name, The American Spectator. In 1986, Mr. Terrell moved The American Spectator to what he called the center of the political circus, or as we all infamously know as Washington, D.C. Mr. Terrell has placed emphasis on improving the investigative journalism of The American Spectator as a way to objectively present the facts and actions of the United States government and its politicians. Today, Mr. Terrell remains as the editor-in-chief of The American Spectator, has had his articles appear in such publications as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, National Review, the Sunday Telegraph, New York Magazine, and the Yale Law Journal. Former White House spokesman Larry Speaks numbers Mr. Terrell among former President Reagan's 4 favorite columnists. The London Times calls him a man of great mental energy and enthusiasm, and former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld has called him one tough guy. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Robert Emmett Terrell Jr.
Well, it's nice to be here. It's nice of you to join us. And Tom, I didn't think you sounded like a commie there, Tom. I thought you sounded a little like one of these Tea Party people that we hear about. So maybe there's not as much difference between a commie and a Tea Party person as I thought from my Wall Street redoubt. But I'm going to, can you hear me here? Yeah. All right. I want to put the 1964 election into some perspective, and I find that it'll probably explain to you Tuesday afternoon, Tuesday's doings, because I think Tuesday's going to be a surprise for my left-wing friends. 1964 was billed then and for years to come as the end of that era's sudden political monstrosity, American conservatism. For years to come, we were told that conservatism died or committed suicide in 1964 with the nomination of Barry Goldwater. And so ended, supposedly, another anomaly from the American one-party state, at least for those who think that it is right and just for there to be a one-party state in a democratic system. Actually, for us, those that are historically minded, 1964 was the end, was not the end, but the beginning, possibly the beginning of the beginning. It was the beginning of what has been, for mainstream media, and come to think of it, the university, the academy, the longest, it was to become the longest dying political movement in American history. American conservatism. Since 1964, conservatism's obituaries have been filed with timely regularity, year after year. And through it all, I felt pretty good, actually. And I suggest that my other conservative friends should have felt pretty good, too. Conservatism is more often reported on in its fragmentation, frailties, dissensions, and rigor than in its vitality. Compare conservatism with but one famous left-wing family, the Clintons. They have been taking America on a roller coaster ride for years, with their own ups and downs, somehow never their fault. There is a cyclical pattern to the roller coaster rides that they take us on. First, the media report with great expectations the Clintons' enormous capacity for good, their brilliance and their competence, their good nature, call it their charisma. Think of Bill as he was approaching the 1992 election. He was the boy governor, abounding with promise. Then, disaster. Jennifer Flowers appeared. Revelations of draft dodging were heard. Pot smoking, anti-war protests in old London, all accompanied by almost ceaseless lies that were promptly exposed every time Bill uttered them. It seems to me any prior presidential candidate ever caught in just one of these scandals would have been forced out of the race immediately. And as for the race immediately, suddenly the media were thrust into the cycle. Gloom, sudden despair, then of a sudden, hope springs eternal. Bill kept plugging away. He came back, the comeback kid. I coined a term for those infected by this palliative condition in the media. The term is the episodic apologists. And the episodic apologists have been with the Clintons in the media for 20 years or more. Always a cycle is repeated. High hopes, then indignation, tinged with despair, then hope renewed. The cycle has been repeated a dozen times. Even at the very end of Bill Clinton's 2 terms in the White House, it was on display. He is about to leave the White House, and despite his impeachment, his popularity is about as high as ever. Then the public gets word of his last-minute, scandalous and corrupt pardons. Then word gets out of Mrs. Clinton's pilfering from the White House and her staff's practical jokes committed against the incoming administration. The media are generally thrust down into the deepest despair. There is disappointment everywhere. A dozen high-powered Democrats such as Joe Biden, washed their hands of the Clintons very publicly. And if you don't believe me, do a Google on that period. The Clintons were held in anathema by the very Democrats that had loved them so much for all those 8 years. The New York Times and the New York Observer called for investigations. They say the Clinton critics were right all along. The Observer actually called for Mrs. Clinton to resign from the Senate. Again, Google it. You'll find it right there. But 2001 did not end without these papers and others suggesting that Mrs. Clinton would make a great presidential candidate. And Bill Clinton would become a fitting candidate for the United Nations Secretary General. Again, Google it. You'll find it there. Hope springs anew, and not for the last time. It goes into the very present. Today, Hillary, despite Benghazi and a stint at state that does not bring to mind Henry Kissinger, is again touted as the inevitable candidate. The left, as reported by the left, is always full of promise and achievement, bright and wondrous morns, whereas conservatism has been at death's door since 1964. After Goldwater's demise came Richard Nixon's demise and Watergate. Richard Nixon, though admired at least by me, was no movement conservative. Yet, when he left the White House under a cloud, conservatism suffered too, and it was allegedly once again moribund. In truth, it was growing, and its strength was about to be unavoidably seen. Originally, it was composed of 3 parts: traditional conservatives, libertarian conservatives, and Tom's anti-communist conservatives. In the Nixon years, it gained strength with a powerful group of new recruits whose wandering liberals tired of the increasing radicalization of liberalism. They were called the neoconservatives. And in Les Lankowski here tonight, we have one neoconservative here in the room. They were called the neoconservatives. By the time Ronald Reagan was elected president, the neoconservatives were a powerful force, a powerful new force in the Republican Party. People like the Crystals, the Podhorises, Gene Kirkpatrick, and even Pat Moynihan, who, by the way, sometime in that period came down to the establishment with me and had a grand time with us. With Reagan came another new contribution to the conservative movement, the Reagan Democrats. Not that with Reagan came the mainstream media's recognition of conservative vitality. Remember, right up to Reagan's victory in what would be called a wave election today, the media told us that Ronald Reagan against Jimmy Carter was too close to call. By the late 1980s, the religious right was a new recruit to conservatism. We were stronger than ever. Yet, when Clinton came to office, conservatism was again being reported upon as moribund. Even with Newt Gingrich's historic sweep 2 years after Bill's election, the media was reporting the conservatives' frailty. We were supposedly susceptible to extremism, as though the post-McGovern Democrats had not suffered what was to become a permanent state of radicalization, which again will explain the events of next week. With the year 2000's election of George W. Bush, the conservative movement was in place for years to come. Alas, by the year 2008, conservatism was again near death's door, at least according to the experts. Its adepts were too white, too male, too old, and too extreme. No one in the mainstream media took note of the historic fact that in 2008, America had a chance to elect the first black president. Frankly, even I was fetched by the prospect of a presidency by Barack Obama. I don't believe he could have lost in 2008 if he were running against George Washington. It took only 2 years for Obama's extremist politics, inspired by the left-wing drift of the Democratic Party, to ensure another wave election for us. By then, conservatism had received added vigor from the amorphous group called the Tea Partiers. 2010 was another wave election for conservatism in the House of Representatives and throughout the country. The election should have told us a lot more than the 2012 election told the mainstream media. 2012 was essentially a reenactment of the historic 2008. 2010 was a precursor for 2014, and I dare say it will prove to be a precursor for 2016. In 2010, conservatives amounted to something like 40 to 44% of the population, a proportion that has been stable for years. The liberal component of the population in 2010 was what it has been for roughly 30 years, 18 to 22%. In 2010, the independent portion of the population was roughly 35%, and that's the important element in the election to keep an eye on. The majority of that vote went to the Republicans pushed by the country's sick economy and wildly imbalanced budgets. In 2014, the independents will vote again, pushed by economics and sudden fears about the international terrorism and Ebola. The election will be another wave election. Moreover, given the extremism of the left in the Democratic Party, I see this alliance between conservatives and independents as lasting for years to come. When conservatives will again be called or reported on as reposing at death's door, I cannot say. But I did write a book a couple of years ago titled The Death of Liberalism. In 2014, in the 2014 election next week, you will see why I wrote it. Goldwater conservatism, born in 1964, has steadily grown. It was no fluke. It has elected powerful political figures and implemented an enormous number of policies, some that were resonant in 1964, some that were unimaginable then. It has contributed to the election of 5 presidents, and with Ronald Reagan, one of the 2 great presidents of the 20th century. And for those of you who think I never have a nice word to say for liberalism, let me assure you, the other great president of the 20th century was Franklin Roosevelt. And let me conclude by looking back to the 1960s in Bloomington, Indiana. You have all heard that the dominant voices of the 1960s were the voices of left-wing youth. Actually, as Richard Scammon and Ben Wattenberg have chronicled, the youth vote went Republican even in 1972. As for Indiana University, if you have any interest in the 1960s, you have all heard about the great demonstrations and library burnings of the era. Presumably, you are familiar with the homegrown Che Guevaras, many of whom did, in fact, stay pretty close to home all these years. But let me mention some of my friends who left Bloomington to make a mark in Washington and on the world. Then tell me who became more influential in America, the Bloomington left or the Bloomington right. To begin with, there is Tom Charles Houston, who headed the largest student organization in the country while he was here, the Young Americans for Freedoms. Its equivalent on the left was the Students for Democratic Society, co-founded by Tom Hayden, with whom I've competed a few times on radio and television since then. I saw Tom's picture the other day in the New York Times. If Marion Jane Fonda leaves you looking ravaged as it makes him look, I would prefer Houston's wife. Orwell says that every man by a certain age gets the face he deserves. And boy, did Tom Hayden get it. Tom Charles Houston went on to work for the White House under Richard Nixon. And of course, create the Houston Plan. With me in the 1960s were other conservatives. For instance, Robert Turner, head of the Victory in Vietnam organization. He has, for 40 years, been an advocate for strong foreign policy and other good causes. Most recently as a professor at the University of Virginia Law School. Then there was another undergrad here at Bloomington in the 1960s, Jim Bopp. Jim Bopp has been an influential voice in the pro-life movement, not only statewide, but nationally, as counsel of the National Right to Life organization. And he's been a figure in various other conservative endeavors. Then, of course, there's the legendary Baron von Cannon. Baron von Cannon worked with me to start the magazine here, and he left for the Heritage Foundation, of which you've probably heard. He is the vice president there, and for decades has been leading the forces for good on the conservative side. Steve Davis left Bloomington in late 1960s, having founded our magazine with me, and became an aide to Congressman Phil Crane, himself an IU alum. Luann Sabatier served with me on the American Spectator here in Bloomington and left with me for Washington in 1986, where she now serves as Chief Executive Officer of the company that owns the Washington Examiner and the Weekly Standard. Then there is me. For 47 years, the editor-in-chief of the American Spectator. Frankly, I have no complaints about a dead-end job. It allowed me to write a dozen books, even a New York Times bestseller. It allowed me to play a seminal role in the impeachment of my friend Bill Clinton, if seminal is the proper word. And I also managed to report on a lot of low deeds in high places. I've been allowed an amusing life, and I've had the last laugh. Thank you.
We're going to open this up now to questions, and if you would like to ask a question, just head over to the microphone area. We'll take answers up here, and just anybody feel free to do it. Maybe let me throw out one of my student questions first, just a quick one. What was the biggest lesson you took away from the Goldwater? This is Josie Kincaid, who just left, I think. What was the biggest lesson you took away from the Goldwater campaign that you used later in your career? If you can do a quick answer.
Try winning. I think that we all understood that at some point, while you drive a certain degree of satisfaction, that kamikaze politics doesn't work. And that's one of the reasons why I opted to work with President Nixon, Vice President, when he was a candidate, starting in '66. And I think that the movement has matured, and that this is the 50th anniversary of Ronald Reagan's time for choosing speech. You can see it easily on YouTube. You compare that to his campaign in 88, you begin to see the translation. So I think that it was a valuable lesson. I have no criticism of how the campaign was run in '64, but I think the fact was that we had to move on, we had to mature.
Biggest lesson that you learned from the '64 campaign?
Well, I learned that I was a freestyler rather than a breaststroker. I didn't participate. I was a swimmer. What am I to say?
Yeah. Okay. Okay, let's start with questions. And just, again, we don't want speeches, we want questions, but please identify yourself and we'll get the answers.
Hi, my name is Matt Shute. I am the refounding chairman of the New IU Young Americans for Freedom chapter. It's an honor to hear both of you speak. My question has to do with student activism. I would just like to know, because both of you were very prominent student activists back in the 60s, what strategies were successful for you that will still apply today, and which strategies might have changed over the years, so we need to take a different approach here in 2014. Thank you.
My feeling is that you have a twofold mission. I mean, one of the challenges that we had in the 60s was that because the liberalism was identified as the sole intellectual tradition, and that we had to demonstrate that we were serious people and we could engage in serious discourse. And one of my favorite memories of IU is when in 1963 in May, my mother came down from Logansport and we went into the Fancy room for the initiation ceremony in the Phi Beta Kappa, and one of the liberal dons saw me come through the door and he looked at me and said, "What are you doing here?" I mean, it never occurred to him that a politically conservative individual could be a decent student. But I think that half your program, half your activity has to be intellectual, has to be addressed to policy and taking on the left intellectually. And then the F, the difference between the F and ISI is the F is a political action group, which means you need to be involved in political issues. And there are a number of issues right now which if I were your age, I'd be stirring up the pot on. I mean, I think that the whole situation in the Mideast, the failure to deal effectively with the extremists in Iraq, the early pullout of Iraq, the having a top White House aide refer to one of our great allies as being a chicken poop. I mean, absolutely incredible. I mean, I served at the White House. I know you don't make those kind of statements unless you're pretty comfortable that the guy in the Oval Office is going to be content with that. So there are a lot of active political issues that I think are legitimate issues that could be exploited politically. But the key thing in our strategy always was to expand the base. We started with 15 kids. I signed up when Bill Jenner was our YAP chairman, and we signed up 290 some the first time we circulated. So our strategy was always to expand the base, and don't be afraid to take them on. Those, I always thought the main thing you had to do was address the liberals at their strongest point. Take on the best that they got. That's what you want to do.
Strategic lessons from the 60s still applicable today.
Well, I pick up on what Tom said. I don't know if you, I hope you picked up what I said during my talk, and that is that conservatism has steadily picked up new adherents. It picked up the neocons. It picked up most recently the Tea Partiers. It picked up the Reagan Democrats, the evangelicals. And it has been an expanding movement, whereas actually the liberals have been kind of a diminishing movement throughout the years. And so they just kind of take society and they divide it up and they take the kind of, I coined a term for this. So they take their traditional liberal base and they sort of rename it every now and then. They rename it environmentalists. I mean, the truth of the matter is, I have nothing against the environment. I'm somewhat offended by their claim that they're the environmentalists. I'm an environmentalist. My wife happens to be a woman, and she's a little bit offended by the notion that that the liberals speak for all women, and we should continue to expand. And I'll tell you this: come this election next week, there are going to be a lot of liberals looking for a new direction, and they could very easily be lured into our camp. And the independents are going to be, this election, they're very serious about the economy. They're always very serious about the economy. But now they're very concerned about international terrorism, and they're concerned about Ebola. And those people are ripe pickings for our movement. So I agree with Tom. He's had more experience in politics than I have. And we should continue to expand our base, because I'll tell you, liberalism, or as I call it, the left wing in America, is in decline. It's only strong here at the university, and it's only can be strong here at the university because after all, the university is an authoritarian state. It's not a democracy. Wherever democracy prevails, we have a fighting chance, and we certainly have a fighting chance with the independent vote.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Kagan Ferguson. I'm a sophomore studying law and public policy in SPEA. Mr. Houston, at one point in your speech, you said that the Republican Party used to be dominated by those on Wall Street, the bankers and the financiers. With the 2010 Citizens United decision, which allowed for unlimited campaign contributions for corporations, unions, and other politically interested groups, do you fear that the corporations and the wealthiest Americans will once again start to dominate politics within the United States?
No, I don't. I think that, first of all, I know there's people dismiss the notion that corporations are people, although every lawyer understands that corporations have been treated as jurisdictional people since 1817 by the Supreme Court. So, but the critical question is how do you view money in politics? My view is that money is conducive to expression and speech. And the best example is that if you're an incumbent, you don't have to spend money to introduce yourself to the electorate. So they know who you are. If I run for office tomorrow, I got to spend a big ton of money just letting people know who the heck I am. So when these people say, well, we want to even the table and have public financing and we'll just have each guy get X dollars, that's an incumbent protection bill. How does that advance free speech? And so I think the difference is that if you look at where the big money's coming from, you hear a lot about the Koch brothers, you hear a lot about the Soros. You don't hear much about Soros, but Soros puts out billions. The rich hedge fund people are the big money people. And corporations generally don't want to get involved. Most public corporations don't want to take sides on a political issue. And so I think that's kind of a red herring. And the unions obviously are no one suggests that the unions ought to quit contributing. They take the biggest source of funding are the teachers union and the trial lawyers, both of which are special pleaders in my judgment. And so I don't worry about that. The difference is that when the Wall Street guys called the Republican Party, the banking system was entirely different. You had community banks, and they had to do business through the New York banks for lots of reasons. And what would happen is, and they would call up their local bankers and say, remember, that loan we got out there, the advances we're making, we sure hope your people are going to be supportive of Wendell Willkie or Tom Dewey. And now I didn't I'm a populist. I admit that. I don't back off with that. And I think that I don't want any special interest controlling the process. But I think money is fungible. And all I care is that everybody have enough money to be credible and be competitive. And that's what I think our objective ought to be.
Any comments on Citizens United?
I would say this, that it's not clear to me that big money in politics only finds its way into Republican hands. It finds its way into Democratic hands, and it happens to be it's the money of kind of crazy people, isn't it? It's the money of Hollywood. I mean, do you want Jane Fonda running America, or would you like a Wall Street banker? I guess I'd rather have neither of them running America, and I let the big money speak for itself out of Hollywood, and I'm delighted they're giving as much of their money as they are to Obama and to the Democrats, because it's going to be wasted, and I'm glad to see them waste their money.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Drew Goldman. I'm a freshman in Ms. Youngke's Civic Leaders Living Learning Center. As a student at IU who currently identifies as a Democrat, who is trying to educate himself on both parties and really make the decision for himself, as opposed to listening to his parents' ideology, I've done a lot of research, as much as I can, and everything that I'm seeing in the news leads me to believe that the Conservative Party, the vibe surrounding it is mostly an anti-liberal party. How can you try to convince me to be a conservative, just so that I can hear, hopefully, something semi-convincing that gives some light to that side? Because at the moment it seems very evil empire as construed by the media, as what you're saying, and by the unintelligent people at Fox News. Thank you.
Well, I'll tell you this: that liberalism has one fundamental political principle. It's not freedom. You probably think freedom's a good thing. I think freedom's a good thing. They think freedom's a good thing until suddenly they find a freedom that the freedom to smoke cigarettes. They don't like that anymore. They did like it about 50 years ago, but now they don't like it. You think perhaps order is a good thing, and perhaps an orderly society that conforms to certain norms is the kind of thing you want. But you will find the one fundamental principle that liberals support time and time again, and come back to time and time again, is disturbing the peace. And that is found a misdemeanor in every criminal code in the world, except perhaps Sharia law. I don't know about that. But so I think if you want an orderly society, a free society, I think you'd find the conservative to be the side that you'd be on.
Well, I think liberalism has a great tradition. I'm not here to bash. I just don't agree with certain aspects of it. I mean, I think there's no question. When I was National EAF chairman, I was kind of known as a liberal on civil rights issues, and it was, in my judgment, true that we were lagging behind, worrying about the constitutional effect of public accommodations, when the reality was that we ought to be more worried about making sure that everybody had the rights of access to the opportunities that everyone should take advantage of. So I think that there's but the Democratic part of the liberal movement has really, we can hear about how the rights become more conservative. I really don't think that's true. I think that if you look at 1964, I think the differences by what Bob said has become much more diverse. There are more elements. I mean, remember in 1964, we didn't have any of these so-called social issues. I don't ever remember anyone talking about abortion. I didn't know a single person when I was on this campus that smoked pot. It was a whole different world from what you kids know. And but I think the thing that most strikes me about the contemporary liberal temperament is that if there was anything 50 years ago that you could bet your last dollar on, is that the liberals would defend freedom of speech. Under any circumstance, they would defend freedom of speech. And now liberals have come up with all sorts of ideas on how to limit freedom of speech, and they talk about money. We're going to cut off money. The FEC just talked about how they need to control the internet, and that is an entire change of approach. I don't understand it, but remember one thing: if you go back to, as far as you can go in history, there always have been two parties. Jefferson wrote that, that there were two parties. Now, he thought it was the party of liberty and the party of aristocracy. And I think even today we probably got people in this room that think that's a pretty good description of the two-party system today. But I think that at the end of the day, I always think that certain people come to believe that man is capable of perfection. And if you believe man is capable of perfection, then government is a perfect institution by which theoretically you ought to be able to effect that perfection. If on the other hand, if there's someone like me who believes in original sin, who doesn't think man is capable of perfection, I don't think that you change the circumstances of all by just, if you put Bob and I in charge of the government, we're going to do, what we think's right. And if we put some of our liberal friends in charge, they're going to do what they think's right. And, people don't change their basic character by simply being vested with governmental power. And so the idea that somehow that you're virtuous individuals and when you put them in government, the government becomes virtuous is nonsense. And that's why historically our framers always were suspicious of governmental power, wanted to limit the power of government because they never thought you could trust individuals with great power. And so if you ask me what I think the basic difference is that I don't believe you can trust any person in government with great power without restriction. And when the president doesn't think he's bound by the law, doesn't think he has to pay attention to Congress, then I think you've destroyed the system that we've had for a long 200 plus years in this country, and I think it's a mistake.
Well, Tom, I would like to point out that the trajectory of the liberal from being in favor of free speech to opposing free speech is a perfect example of the one political principle that they never change. They're always they're always in favor of disturbing the peace. And again, that's a misdemeanor in every criminal code except possibly Sharia.
Okay.
Next, let's ask a follow-up question.
Just real quick. You got it.
On the freedom of speech topic, a certain issue comes to mind. I remember seeing a story regarding the war on Christmas and that being an enormous Republican-sponsored, conservatively-sponsored movement as to the repression of the majority's religion in America, and that was seen by an enormous number of Democrats as a limitation of free speech. So I'm not entirely sure what you meant when you said that the Democrats are leading that charge to limit free speech, as opposed to...
Is there such a thing as a war on Christmas, and was it manufactured by the right to make the left look bad? I guess, is that...
I don't think so. I think the war against Christmas is led by Scrooge.
Well, I let me say, I think that's a big subject to get into. I'm going to do it, but let me say this: that there's a substantial disagreement among conservatives as to exactly what is an appropriate response to the so-called war on terror. First of all, I don't think there is such a thing as a war on terror. I think there's a war on terrorists, and that terror is simply a technique, a strategy that is used by terrorists to achieve their political objectives. And, I have grave reservations myself with respect to certain aspects of the Patriot Act, for example. And I mean, certainly Senator Paul has, very strong reservations about it. So I don't think that is an issue that's a defining issue. Probably one of the strongest defenders of the so-called war on terror, Senator Feinstein, who's a liberal Democrat by any standard, who's chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. So I think that the broader issue, I think, is the question of how free should we be? Should government, to what degree should government regulate the lives of ordinary people under ordinary circumstances? Do I have an obligation to use government to serve my economic objectives? Do I have the right to force you to learn certain things, utter certain no's? So I think that's a broader issue, but it is a defining issue. I think that clearly in American political history, if you look back along from the very beginning, trying to reach a consensus of what do we mean by liberty is probably the basis for most political thought and most political debate in this country since the revolution. So you're welcome to the club.
Thank you very much.
Let's move on.
My name is Guy Loftman. I was a freshman once at Indiana University. That was 1963. I came as a Goldwater Republican and fraternity pledge. It wasn't Phi Psi, or maybe the world would have turned out differently for me. 18 months after I came, I was one of the dozen people who organized the first anti-Vietnam War demonstration on campus. I was one of the founders of Students for Democratic Society on campus, SDS, and later its president. I did quit SDS when the government took over. It became a violent organization. I've certainly followed the two of you and only echo Bob Turl's statement that, to me, the fact that the two of you, and particularly Jim Bob, have been immensely influential coming out of that crucible of the 60s here is a fascinating fact that I don't know exactly how to explain, but it's been very...
You can explain it by one thing: talent.
ambition.
Well, let's get a question.
I was just kidding.
I know.
Before I so rudely interrupted myself. Since the Goldwater campaign, I view the arc of American politics, American effective politics, American politics as it affects the masses, if I might, is that it has steadily concentrated wealth in the hands of the rich, steadily vilify poor people, engaged in mass incarceration, which I see as a terrible disaster in the name of people who believe in freedom. Eisenhower, who I like Ike, who was my first political campaign, had a 92% marginal tax rate, income tax rate. That's the kind of Republicans I liked. So my question is, do you agree that contemporaneously with the Goldwater to today conservative development, and I would say rise to at least occasional dominance, has been accompanied by a great increase in disparity of wealth, vilification of the poor, racial regress. And if you agree that that's the arc, to what extent do you think that the conservatism is supported by the rich, of the rich, and for the rich, and that's the reality we see?
You know, I love I remember Eisenhower's, how he was vilified for golfing. And then Bill Clinton came into the White House and he golfed. And Obama came into the White House and he golfed and golfed and golfed. And when he wasn't raising money, and who was he raising money from? But the very, very rich. As for this vilification of the underclass, and I assume you mean the blacks, what is the President of the United States color, may I ask? And what is the color of Oprah Winfrey? And what is the color of so many of these Hollywood actors and actresses? I think that your claim that, and by the way, incarceration's a good thing. Crime's gone down, incarceration's gone up. I'd say that's a pretty good thing. I think that the attempt to make this a racist society, a class-riddled society. I mean, what is the Tea Party? The Tea Party is nothing if it isn't middle class or lower class. I don't quite understand it, but you're welcome to your little world of racists and class-oriented, maybe aristocrats and carriages and things like that riding around Bloomington. But I don't agree with you, and I think that my view will stand up. Barack Obama is a black man. He was elected in 2008 in large part because he was a black man, and Americans willingly gave up any claim to racial prejudice to elect this man president, and they did it twice. And they might do it a third time, but I think the third time the black guy will be on our side. So, at any rate.
Tom? No response. So, thank you. Let's make this we've got food coming out.
All right. I was in 7th grade in 1960. My name is Jeff Zagrin, and Nixon and Kennedy had those neat debates, and I actually owned them on tape. And I wonder if you guys know the truth of this matter. I've heard apocryphally that Goldwater and Kennedy had a handshake saying if they were both running in 64, they would stump the country together on sort of almost the old-fashioned trains and debate each other at the railroad stops. And if you know that that's true, I hope it is. Do you agree that that's a sort of quiet tragedy that no one even talks about Kennedy's assassination? By the way, I was for Nixon, and I was strongly for Goldwater the way up. So don't think there's a trick to my question.
Well, when you try to go into contra-factual history, you open up all sorts of fantasy worlds. But I think it would have been an entirely different political world had President Kennedy not been assassinated. People forget that his congressional agenda was grinding to a halt, that while he was personally popular, that there was a lot of dissension within his party. Remember that when he proposed the Civil Rights Act that ultimately President Johnson pushed through, that the fact was that a majority of the Republicans in both houses of the Congress voted for the Civil Rights Act, and the majority of the Democrats in the Senate voted against it. And I think that if President Kennedy had survived and had been the candidate for re-election, and Senator Goldwater had been nominated, which it would have been a different dynamic within the party between him and Rockefeller, I think. But if he had been the nominee, I've heard the same story. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's my understanding that Kennedy and Goldwater did have such an understanding, and I think it would have been a great educational experience. I think that Kennedy would have been difficult to defeat. I think we were ahead of our time, Goldwater, plus his frankness was never welcome at any time. But it would have been a different environment. And I think that one of the great, a lot of reasons, those of us who will remember exactly where we were when the president was shot, I think America would have been a different place. We would have avoided a lot of the violence and ugliness of the counterculture. But we live with what we're dealt. The cards were dealt, and we had our ability predicated upon our response to the circumstances that exist that we have to deal with. And so that's kind of my thought.
Well, actually, Dave Keene wrote, Dave Keene is a mutual friend of Tom and mine, and Dave wrote his column this week in the Washington Times on just that agreement between, and I have to leave you with one quick story. It has nothing to do with John Kennedy, but it has to do with Bob Kennedy. You might find this interesting. I've given some thought to writing my memoirs, And if I write my memoirs, I think I will begin with a 1968 instance where Bob Kennedy spoke here at the auditorium. And I, the inveterate reporter, snuck behind him, behind the curtain on the center stage. And when he turned, I was the only person on stage behind the curtain. There was no one there. There were police were there. I was the only guy there. And Bob Kennedy turned to me and he said, "Where do we go?" He thought I was his advance man. So I said, "This is too good to pass up." And so I started going a little bit to the left, and that wasn't where to go. These big curtains are all around us, and I go off to the right, and that wasn't where to go. "This way, boss, just keep going." So I finally found the way out of the, it was off to the left, and we saw it today, Al. It's at the back of the auditorium. To the left, there's an exit. And I led him down the stairs to his waiting car. And he got in his waiting car, and he raised his hand to shake my hand. And in his hand, I put a Reagan for President button. And he laughed. And yes, he laughed. And frankly, I've always been a little partial to Bob Kennedy. And I've also been reminded that 1 month later, he was in the same situation and with a political enemy. But that political enemy had a gun and shot him dead in the first act of terrorism, it seems to me, in the modern era.
Well, with that, we need to close the questions. We've got food and refreshments for everybody. Our speakers hopefully can stay around for a little while and mingle. Thank you all for coming. Round of applause for the speakers. Thank you.